This film was, without a doubt, my most anticipated release of the year. I've long been a fan of Nolan's work, so I was necessarily following, with great interest, all the trailers, TV spots, 60-minute interviews, and segments which Nolan and his crew were putting out before the film hit theaters. And from all of these teasers, I was left with the impression that the film would be outstanding from a technical standpoint, but rather weak in its writing and story. Here's what I actually found when I went to see this film in theaters. Hello, and welcome back to Film Friday, in which I review a new film every single week. This week we are looking at the 2026 film entitled The Odyssey, starring Matt Damon, Anne Hathaway, and Robert Pattinson, and directed, of course, by Christopher Nolan. This review may contain some spoilers, so consider yourself warned. Let's get into it. Now, I'm not going to spend all that much time here rehashing the story of a 3,000-year-old myth. Nolan did not fail to stick to the main plot points of the story. After the Greeks win the war in Troy, sacking the city, Odysseus and his crew set sail to return home, but are waylaid by many monsters and strange adventures on their way, which delays the return by many years. Meanwhile, back in his home kingdom of Ithaca, his wife Penelope is besieged by suitors who are trying to marry her in Odysseus' absence. Now, from a technical standpoint, the Odyssey was incredible. The animatronics and the visual effects of the various monsters were outstanding. Circe's transformation of the crew into pigs was appropriately disturbing and horrifying. The cinematography was overall solid, we'll come back to that, and at times very beautifully done. And the score by Ludwig Göransson was fantastic, which, in fairness, is not that much of a surprise. For anyone who is unfamiliar with his work, he was the composer behind two other Nolan films, Tenet and Oppenheimer, and he has also been responsible for the score on other projects like Sinners, Black Panther, and the Disney Plus TV show, The Mandalorian. But leaving all that praise for the Odyssey aside, I did have three major issues with this film. First of all, the Odyssey is flawed in its adaptation of Homer's work. Now, I am, admittedly, not as bothered by some of these changes as the classicists of the world would be, and in fact, I'm willing to overlook many details that might have been changed that can be found in Homer's original work but aren't in Nolan's. But there were some moments from the original myth that stood out to me as a child and have stuck with me ever since that I wish Nolan would have worked harder to incorporate. For instance, Nolan very intentionally removed the trick which Odysseus plays on the Cyclops, in which Odysseus tells the Cyclops that his name is Nobody. This, in the original myth, has a wonderful payoff. The Cyclops, having been blinded, calls upon his fellow Cyclopses, Cyclops, to help him, because nobody is attacking him. Now, Nolan insisted that it would not have worked to include this moment because no English translation can do justice to the pun behind the ancient Greek meaning of calling yourself nobody. And that may be a very real translation issue, but I think it's also fair to say that most of us did not grow up hearing or reading the Odyssey in the original ancient Greek. I know I didn't, but that moment remained iconic and humorous nonetheless. So he really should have kept it in. Second of all, the dialogue in the Odyssey was at times jarringly modern. Now, this was one of the biggest criticisms which I had for the film before it was released, based on the trailers alone. And I will say, the modern dialogue ended up being less of an issue for the film than I thought it would be. Most of the worst moments were included in the trailers, and in fact, one of those was misrepresented by how it was edited into the trailer. The moment in which Odysseus yells, "Let's go," as he leads his troops into battle was not, in fact, a moment in which he was leading his troops into battle, but rather yelling at them to flee from the enemy. Still, not the most eloquent dialogue ever written, but nowhere near as egregious as the trailer made it seem. But in other moments of the film, the dialogue was still painfully modern.
My dad is coming home.
And perhaps the most jarring of these instances comes towards the beginning of the film, when Telemachus addresses Penelope as Mom. I understand Nolan wanted to make the story more approachable for contemporary audiences, but I'm also not sure if, even today, a royal prince addresses his mother, the queen, as Mom. Third and lastly, while the cinematography of the Odyssey was overall very well done, it was, at times, surprisingly bad. There were several moments in which two characters were filmed in conversation in the same shot, as opposed to cutting back and forth between them. And given the extremely shallow depth of field that these IMAX cameras appear to allow for, the focus had to shift back and forth between each of them as they spoke in turn. The problem with this is that the camera operator often missed the mark, and for one instance in particular in which Odysseus and Athena are in conversation in a shot like this, Odysseus spends almost the entire conversation completely out of focus. And even when they did manage to land the focus, the constant shifting back and forth was a huge distraction from the conversation that was actually taking place. At best, it reminded you that you were watching a film. Now, I do understand that the reason which is given for this flaw has to do with the nature of the IMAX cameras themselves. The camera operators and cinematographers have a razor-thin plane of focus to operate within. And in reality, the fact that they landed the focus as much as they did is a testament to their skill. But if this razor-thin plane of focus is actually an insurmountable problem, and not one which they could have fixed by reshooting, or I don't know, reframing the shot to actually cut between characters, then perhaps Nolan should not have filmed the entirety of the Odyssey in IMAX. Especially when one of the reasons he gives for his love of IMAX is how immersive the format is, but then it requires you to do something like this, which really pulls you out of the immersion of the story and reminds you that you are watching a film on cameras. But despite all these criticisms, I do think that the strengths of this film did enough to compensate for these weaknesses. The monsters were fantastic and terrifying, Hades was appropriately eerie, the sacking of Troy was incredible and haunting, and there were moments in Odysseus' homecoming that were incredibly moving. All in all, I would say that Nolan managed to deliver on some of the hardest parts of this film, while failing to deliver on what should have been the easiest. It seems that the discourse surrounding this film has pushed everyone who saw it into two camps: those who think it is a complete pile of garbage, and those who think it is a masterpiece of cinema and Nolan's finest work. I am, unfortunately, forced to conclude that it is neither of those two. It is a solid film overall, with some great entertainment value and some incredible moments of superb cinema, but also some incredible moments of real weakness. With that being said, thank you for watching, and be sure to comment your own thoughts on this film below, and don't forget to subscribe for more movie commentary and reviews.